Mako, what a joy to welcome you to the podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, it's going to be fun
Nice
today. Friends introduced me to your work a couple years ago, actually, and I think it's so timely for this moment in so many listeners' lives. Because I think so many people today, Mako, are walking wounded, so to speak, from mental and emotional health challenges. In fact, this is the first time we've met, so I'll say this, this podcast is all about mental and emotional health, spiritual growth.
Yeah.
And so they're dealing with that, to relationship strain, to physical health issues, and more. And at the same time, I think many of us have been told to despise our brokenness. And I know that's something you've talked about. I'd love to know, just as we start today, what's keeping that narrative, sort of that directive, alive today?
I think you can actually trace it back to the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment, where we had this thought that our minds and this drive toward perfectionism and industrial efficiency can give us a better world. And in one sense, we have, better technology and refrigerators. But when we dehumanized what we do as human beings, we have become human doings, as one of my mentors said, rather than human being. Human being is different from being a human doing. And so what have we lost in that process? And I think during the pandemic, with shutdown and quarantine and restrictions, we became keenly aware of our humanity and brokenness, and how under stress, a lot of what we thought we had were not secure, or were at least tested. And we found ourselves at a loss. And part of it is, we keep wanting to go back to normal, right? Quote normal. But we know today that whatever normality was, if we go back to a new normal, that would be one thing. But even then, it's going to be a different world. And there's something about our vulnerabilities and willingness to perhaps look at the imperfect side of things, some things that are flawed and broken, and certainly after deep trauma, as we have been through, that's one of the first things we have to realize, is that, in some ways we don't get over our trauma. We have to be able to journey with it in some way, and that's part of the, going forward, what we need to think about.
So take me back inside all of that. I want to talk about trauma in this conversation with you, Mako, but why have we been nurtured to despise brokenness in and of itself, even within ourselves?
Right. We are told throughout our lives to, have a better resume, new iPhone, new cars, new fashion. And our culture is driven by an assumption of both this assumed superficial perfection and also utility and efficiency, right? So if we are not effective or successful, so to speak, we examine ourselves and we become better, right? And we improve ourselves. And but most of us who have been through life, we know that the moments that teach us about ourselves the most are moments when those things don't happen. When we fail our own expectations, or when we just fail, period, whether it be our business or life, or And it's at that moment that we come to understand that there's a certain entry that we only have if we have failed, and that allows us to not only grow into something new, but we're really discovering ourselves in that process, and we come to understand that maybe our true selves can only be discovered if we go through difficulties and challenges. And I'm not here saying that we look for those things or look for brokenness or trauma at all, but they tend to be what shapes us, and more importantly, I think we, as artists, we are. That's kind of our entry point into what we do as artists as well.
A lot of our conversation today is going to be explained through the Japanese art of Kenzugi. And this is how I found you, Mako, of course, as we talked about. And it's so stunning. So for those who are unfamiliar with Kenzugi, its history, can you teach us about it? Just give us a flyover about what it is. I've heard you say, in fact, this could be a primer to your answer. I've heard you say that it is an art form of mending, but I'll let you take us in because I think this is going to paint a brilliant picture. Yeah.
Since we're on video here, I have a box here, and inside is this Kenzugi bowl from, this is a Korean bowl mended in Japan in probably like 19th century. As you can see, the broken, it's broken. This ceramic went through brokenness, and then the several generations later, oftentimes what happens is important teaware breaks. A family of tea masters will hold on to the broken vessels and sometimes fragments for many generations. Wow. And then they will finally give this to a Japan lacquer master who Japan lacquer is called urushi in Japan, but urushi is the traditional way of mending or glazing ceramics like this. And what Japan lacquer master does is not to fix it in the way that Western mind will want to, restore it to its original. So the brokenness never happened, but the Japan lacquer master will mend it to make it new. Actually accentuating, as you can see, the fracture here, creating a river of gold, rather than hiding this, fracture. It amplifies the fracture in some way, and then what happens then is that this resulting vessel is far more valuable than the original. So this is a coveted vessel because it's kind of been remade into a new form. And there much more to be told about Kenzugi. Kin is gold, and tsugi means to mend. Wow. But tsugi also means to pass it on to the next generation. So Kenzugi is an art form that speaks about the new. Yeah. In my book, Art Plus Faith, Theology of Making, I have a chapter on Kenzugi, and I talk about how this is so relevant, especially to Christians after Easter, because post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, Jesus not only is resurrected as glorified human being, but he's also resurrected as a wounded, glorified human being. And that is very significant here. The only place where we know about God's power in resurrection, there is this mark, nail mark, of suffering and trauma still with the glorified Savior. So that means brokenness is important. That means the trauma is renewed in some way that I don't fully understand, but Kenzugi points to that reality probably as clearly as any metaphor can.
It's so beautiful, and I want to overlay this concept of Kenzugi on top of our own lives.
Yeah.
Love for you to talk about the power and possibilities in redemption then through trauma, through tragedy, any personal challenge, and really the perspective we can gain, because you just said it. The restored version is more valuable than the original. That's fascinating,
Right.
but I'd love for you to teach us.
Well, personally, I'm a survivor of 9/11. I was trapped underneath the towers in the subway that day, and my 3 children became ground zero children. We stayed for 10 years after, so until my youngest daughter graduated, we were there. And so, we had to face ground zero every day as we went out of our loft, and so that meant looking at the escaping hole, this reality of pain and suffering that our neighborhood went through, and the world really. But I never really thought of myself as a survivor. I wasn't in a building. But then I actually had this experience of bringing a Kenzugi ball like this to Columbine High School on their 20th commemoration, and I brought a very important Kenzugi ball that is given to the school, and it's there for students and parents to look at. But I was talking about Kenzugi and passing this around, and people were feeding the ceramic from 17th century, and one of the parents said, I can feel the trauma, and that is truly the case. Japanese history is full of trauma, and especially in the 17th and 18th century, there's intense feudal conflicts, and so in that trauma, one of the survivors of Columbine High School came up to me and she said, I've read your books on 9/11 and afterwards, and you're welcome here anytime because you're a survivor too. And I never thought of myself as that way. But today I can say the same to everyone listening, that you're also a survivor. You're a survivor of the pandemic. There's no one alive today who is not that. So what does that mean? Well, that means we will go through same kind of, post-trauma responses. We will be able to move on and, find this new normal for a while. And then all of a sudden you discover these hairline fractures that you didn't know existed. And it could come out 20 years later, as a case in my life. My real darkness came 15 to 16 years later after 9/11. And so that kind of, life or experience is something that we will all go through in some way. But the thing about this is, as Kenzugi, as a way of understanding that brokenness is a way into the new, is something that all of us resonate with. Because we have been through this trauma together, there's something very unique about this time and this time moving forward. If we are able to harness that into generative, creative means, then that means that, as people have experienced after the Black Plague in 500 years ago, we will find new culture arising, a new renaissance arising out of our time. But that is easier said than done. It requires so many ways of us understanding our lives in a different lens, and so that's part of what Kenzugi brings to us.
Do you think brokenness is the primary way to get to the new?
I used to think that it was one of the ways. Certainly it is one of the ways. But after the pandemic, I begin to think, maybe it is the only way. and I wish it wasn't the case. I wish we could tell our children, that you can learn about life without brokenness and failures and suffering. But unfortunately, it seems like, at least today, there's no one who wasn't affected by the pandemic. So in some ways, we all had to suffer. And one of the discoveries that I think we can make of our time is that, there's always this awakened sense of grace operating in that. And artists are kind of the first to recognize that and turn into their music, their art, their poetry without even knowing. And our intuition finds its way to mend and to heal. And so if we can redirect our traumas into something that is, profoundly real, with a capital R, we will be able to find that voice that we didn't have before. So that is only because we have been through brokenness.
Mako, I'm really fascinated by this, and to the extent you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to go back inside your story. Can you describe what were those hairline fractures? What were the dark places of your life that later led to you coming to this realization of beauty from brokenness? Because I want to pull this out of it being maybe sort of a platitude for people. This is your story, but I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, there are many fractures that I went through in my life, and one certainly, the 9/11 journey is certainly one of them. 3/11 tsunami in Japan caused so much devastation, and then after that, all of a sudden, what we don't exactly know what happened, but my wife walked away from our marriage without any recourse. So I ended up, after trying to do everything to, reconnect with her, she was not able to, and so, I went through a strange divorce process in which I didn't know exactly what was happening. And then my parents passed away in the span of about a year or so. That was probably the darkest time in my life, and many of my friends came in to play a big role in my recovery, my Kenzugi journey, and our common friend Ian Crone was certainly one of them. But this is when Kenzugi became came alive in a certain way, because I knew about Kenzugi from my studies in Japan. I went back for graduate school. I was born in Boston, and then spent my childhood years in Japan, but then went to middle school through college in the United States. So I went back for graduate school to study 17th century art form of Japanese art called Nihonga. It is now known as Nihonga, Japanese style painting, and discovered Kenzugi and the history of Christian persecution in Japan. I write about that in my previous book, Silence and Beauty. But it just came to a new focus as I was going through my dark period, and then recovering from that. 2 years ago, I was remarried to an incredible leader, Hejin Shim, who is founder of Embers International organization that whose sole goal is to end human trafficking in our generation. And she's the co-founder of this incredible journey. And we just traveled through India and so forth. Just came back from this Eye of the Storm experience. But Kenzugi, both of us have experienced, brokenness. So ours is a Kenzugi marriage. We have rediscovered a new calling through the brokenness, and we have such empathy for those who are going through difficult times and impossibility of being trapped in human trafficking, for example, and unable to escape that generational curse. We are able to at least see, create a new path for them. So, this kind of energy, dedication to, this single-mindedness toward restoration and healing probably comes because we both feel that there is hairline fractures that, we're still discovering. So that compels us to not only see ourselves differently, as a Kenzugi master will see us, that we can not only tend to it, mend it, but something new can come out of that.
Well, there's a paradigm shift available for all of us today. And so for those listening who are harboring pain from yesterday, Mako, or even years ago, their own restoration isn't simply about fixing. This is a fundamental principle of Kenzugi. It's not about fixing, it's about creating. Teach this out through the idea of Kenzugi. Speak to the listener, speak to the viewer about how their pain that they're harboring, whether it be from yesterday, like I said, or years ago, is less about fixing, but more about creating.
Right. I always say, talk about generativity or living a generative life, and one of the key elements is that no matter what happened yesterday or day before, a week ago, every moment is a Genesis moment. Every moment is an opportunity to deal with the future, to create the future that ought to be. Now, we are, inhabiting a landscape of pain and trauma. So those are not going to disappear just because we make a fresh journey. But those, fissures and cracks can become an entry point into our journey, actually, that we may never discover until we have been through them, as painful and traumatic as they are. So it's kind of a way to acknowledge that in some ways we don't get over a trauma. I'm never going to be able to put 9/11 past me. There are reminders everywhere, and but at the same time, there's always reality of something that came out of that experience. And almost everything I do as an artist has something to do with that.
I don't at all want to take you back inside a place that's painful. Were you, if I heard you right, you were trapped in one of the buildings?
I was trapped underneath the buildings in the subway.
What happened?
The subway didn't move, so we were trapped for 45 minutes without knowing what happened. And I'm a very visual person. I'm glad I didn't see what happened. Living as we lived 3 blocks away, so, and our children went to public school 2 blocks away. So anything could have happened, and we are very fortunate to be alive. And I think every day for me, when I talk about Genesis moment, I'm reminding myself that every moment is a gift, and that allows me to perhaps look at even the difficulties with a certain amount of joy and grace, because I count it all a gift.
God's presence is real, even in the midst of oppression and darkness. God is the light that shines and places limits on evil and injustice on the earth. Now, here's the question. What if we began to live our lives generatively facing our darkness? What if we all began to trust our intuition in the Holy Spirit's whispers, remove our masks of self-defense, and create into our true identities hidden in Christ beyond the darkness? So unpack this for us, Mako. Living our lives generatively, facing our darkness. What does that mean?
Yeah, I talk about 3 G's of generativity, and generative is a term that's been passed down to me. My father, who was a leading acoustics research scientist, I was born in Boston because he was doing his research with Noam Chomsky on generativity of language. So it's a generational blessing to be able to talk about this. But when I talk about generative life, I pare it down to three ways of talking about it. One is certainly creating Genesis moments, that every moment is fresh. But second G is generosity. And this I often preach to artists, because artists are often creatures under stress and duress, and they're trying to do what they love, paint or write poems or produce theater, and with scarcity all around them and intense battles, and so I tell them that I know artists can be the most generous people in the world, and I've seen that. When we do auctions to benefit culture care, they're the first to come and offer their art so that it can be auctioned, and they're the first to volunteer to be present so that they can help out, and they're also the first to write checks. I've received checks from artists that I know they cannot afford. So I know they can be extraordinarily generous, but the world has shrunken artists' roles into this very utilitarian, transactional reality, and we have kind of sold our souls to this, and so we think we have to be in the defensive. We have to fight for everything, and we have to, win this battle of transactional as well as perhaps in some ways culture wars, reality, propaganda, and I remind them that no, artists are artists because art is a gift. It's not because art can be, successfully deemed to be transactional and commodified and, become rich and famous. No, you are an artist because you have been called by the artist to generously give yourself to the world through your intuition, through your artistry. And when you do that, you are enchanting the world. You're enlivening every person to come alive in that setting. So that generosity is important. And thirdly, generative life is always generational. It is always giving yourself to the next generation, and because culture care cannot happen if it's at least done through 3 generations of parents instructing their children, raising them generatively, so that their lives can be full of this Genesis moments, no matter what they go through, and then that gets passed down to the next generation. So that is part of Kenzugi's history, broken vessels being passed down through generations and given to a Kenzugi master at some point.
What I hear you saying, and I think this is really valuable for all the listeners here today, is that the point of transformation is not ourselves. We are not the point of our own story. We are transformed from the inside out so that we can multiply ourselves and catalyze transformation in the lives of others. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We are, when you think about anything generative, every single part is catalytic. It's this complex ecosystem of interdependence. So it's not just one person dictating how the world ought to be, or it's everybody having different role to play. It's a combination of a kind of growth that require interconnectedness, and also understanding our role in that. So the picture is like jazz. You have multiple instruments playing off of each other. They're distinct, but they're also part of the whole. And that playful improvisation is very much at the heart of I think generative living and generative communities.
Well, this is an interesting point that you bring up, because the second thing I want to say to people is transformation. Yes, we are not the point of our own story, but transformation doesn't happen, as you said, inside ourselves. It happens in community.
Yeah, and we forget that in highly individualized cultures.
Yes.
And we tend to, for instance, read everything, including the Bible, from an individual perspective. When you read the Psalms, it's some of the Psalms are very hard to read because they're imprecatory Psalms, which means they are angry at God, and saying things that perhaps you think you're not supposed to say before God. Very upsetting and traumatic and all that. But when you are in a community of lamenting or grieving or going through suffering, those Psalms come alive because facing ground zero, to be able to tell God that, why did this happen? Why have you forsaken us? Is very important. Now, I could say that as an individual, but it's powerful when you are able to say that collectively together, as a community. So that leads to a certain bonding, I think, communal bonding that can lead to certainly healing. And individual realities are never to be taken apart from the communal realities, but those are connected.
Well, this is really interesting because I think culture, especially in this cultural moment, and you actually touched on this in the book, is so disposable. We dispose of everything. We're so quick. We dump relationships. We cancel people. I mean, this is cancel culture today. And as a result, Mako, you and I both know this, we have become so tribal. So how do we stop this mindset and motivation and then instead move in the opposite spirit that seeks restoration and mending of our broken places instead of, as we talked about, defensiveness, self-protection? How do we move in the opposite spirit that seeks the restoration, the mending of our own broken places?
We have to turn the switch from being transactional, winning that game, to becoming makers again. And I talked about jazz, but that if you go to a jazz concert, there's going to be all sorts of people playing that may not agree with each other on political views. Right. And there's a guy from Europe, there's a guy from Japan, there's a guy from, Harlem. And no one has kind of a same life perspective, and it's impossible to be tribal, But you're on the stage and you're playing different instruments and you're playing together and you're creating something new. On that moment, that the place, the audience can allow you to create, and so that that's a beautiful picture of what can happen if we come together on the same stage of diversity, creating what I call a cultural estuary. Estuary is where diversity of saltwater and freshwater come to mix, and it is the most delicate part of the ecosystem, and you need to preserve estuaries because otherwise the whole system collapses, right? So we have to create these estuaries, cultural estuaries in our own communities, allowing diversity to come through. You don't have to lose your tribalness because tribal realities are important as centers of gravity in cultural, let's say, river. But at the same time, you have to welcome strangers. You have to welcome outsiders, and you have to start creating something new with them. And art forms like jazz, dance, theater, any art form is essentially an expression of the world. First, understanding their tribal identities, but then being exiled from them, right? So it's a journey away from home, and then you discover something away from home in the margins and being exiled, and then you come back, you come home. And that's essentially a cultural history right there. So what happens that is new, that human beings find to be healing of communities, and we live in a time when culture is culture wars. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is, the antidote to that is to work with artists and work with culture that is always generating something new, even if we don't fully agree with them in a sense of ideological principles, but to understand each other, understand our enemy. And Christians are asked to love their enemies, right? And all religions talk about an understanding of each other, the other, with a openness of your heart.
Well, what sticks out in my mind as I hear you say this, and I keep going back to your experience in 9/11 as I think about grief. And I read a couple scientists write that in our fast-paced culture, we've turned grief into metrics and logistics, when instead it should be meaning and narrative.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I'd love to even know how grief played such a role in shaping, again, the Kenzugi process in your own life, beauty that comes from brokenness. How did that play out?
Yeah, it was really the only way that I could wake up every day facing ground zero. Mm-hmm. If I didn't turn that into a way to create a future using my imagination and my art, I wouldn't be here today. Mm. So it's actually as simple as that. I mean, there's just no other choice but to go into the studio, even if you felt utterly depressed or didn't have any energy. My years of training as an artist allow me the privilege of going into my studios every day without even knowing whether that act of faith will turn into something or not. And oftentimes it didn't, right? It didn't cause any immediate change in how, I was able to function, but somehow I believe, because God is the artist, God invites us, creatures of creativity and imagination, to enter into the unknown space with such delight when we are able to just follow our breadcrumbs, into the places of making that we're all called to. It doesn't matter if you're a professional artist or not. We're all called to being part of this creative community somehow. And so, maybe even making of such a community is our act of creativity. But that investment and discipline allows us to carry that task, that difficult task of, living under the weight of whatever it is that we're facing.
I think one of the things I heard you say implicitly in that awesome, beautiful answer was that faith is not certainty. Instead, faith requires mystery. We are in this process. We are learning and discovering, and even what you experienced, what I surmise from your experience is that it was less about moving on for you and more about moving forward. It's not ignoring scars. And I think people here today with us could really benefit from hearing life is not about ignoring scars, ignoring broken places, but instead allowing the healer himself to make something out of it. But we have to yield ourselves in vulnerability for that to take place, right?
Yeah. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. And which means, that word substance is a Greek word, hypostasis. So that means standing under something. I translate it as standing under the weight of hope. And so that means we, so it's interesting. We say we understand something, but oftentimes we are overstanding. We have a preconception of what we want to, get out of a transactional deal.
Back to transactional,
and yet what we're really looking for to understand is to stand under something, to, in a way, submit yourself to, humble yourself. So to the mystery, as you noted, the mystery of what we do not know yet. That's the evidence of things unseen. So what is faith? Faith is fundamentally an act of creation, creativity and making that moves into the unknown by standing under hope, right? And so this reality hits us when we are broken and we don't have our own energy and devices to even step out of our bed every morning. But something carries us into the place of making. And if that can happen, then the Holy Spirit is working in us, through our brokenness, actually, to generate something new that we cannot on our own create. And that's what I have seen in my life for last 30 years, really, but especially after 9/11, I have endeavored to live my life in a way that only God in His miraculous ways can create. I am here simply because God desires for me to create something new today. Yes, in my studio, but in my life, and it's an evidence of the proof of not only God's existence, but proof that standing under hope will lead into or open up the mysteries of the unknown.
Man, that is so profound. Mako, you've used two words in the last few minutes. The first one was hope. The second was submission. Now, both of those words are a little like to some people. What does hope really mean to you? And then what does submission really mean to you? Because I think for many people, hope is like, well, I don't want to hope too much because I don't want to be disappointed. So there's actually a self-defensive, self-protective moment in that, but that's not real hope. The second thing is a lot of people are freaked out, especially in this cultural moment, around the word submission. But you've said that both of those were necessary. Parse those out. Tell people what they mean to you.
Right. So I think you're right. For many people, if they were asked, what are your hopes? Are you hopeful? They'll say, no, I don't know what to hope for anymore. Maybe they had hopes in certain institutions or, certain realities, and now that they've all been proven to be an idol, of sorts, very limited. What they promise cannot deliver. And I think you're right. So to say the word submit in the art world, especially, right, would be like creating such transgressive language. So what I say is, the word authority, right, is also a suspect, right? So I say, well, authority has a word author in it, right? So it's the ability to create a story, a narrative, to create the future. That's authority. And submitting to authority is not necessarily like dumbing yourself down and then doing something that you don't want to do. It's really under, questioning, really, and asking, what is my story? Does what happened to me define me? That whatever that trauma may have been. Or is it going to be a new start, a new beginning into a future that I have the authority to create? And if you have that authorship, right, which we are all given actually, then it would compel us to find others, right? That's storytellers and artists and imaginators and people who understand the difficulty of that journey, yes. Right? The complexity yes. of that journey. So submitting is not just, like bowing down and then receiving somebody else's instruction. It is in part like submitting your story to a publisher or submitting your story to somebody else's purview, right? So you're submitting yourself, offering yourself. Wow. Now that takes courage because it makes you vulnerable for, as you noted, failures and rejection. Mm-hmm. Now you should talk to an artist about that because we get rejected 99% of the time. And we've gotten used to it, so used to it that we think it's kind of funny when something goes right, like what happened, and but that kind of resilience, right, comes paired with creative imagination. You cannot create anything without courage, and you have to open yourself up. You have to be vulnerable to whatever is happening, the mystery of what's going to happen next. Yeah. So artists know this, creators know this, storytellers know this, and entrepreneurs know this because they must have failed at least 5 times before they found whatever was successful. No one comes through, unblemished in a sense. But the entrepreneurs also tell you it was their failures who taught them how to be successful. And artists are the same way.
I think you've just shared such a key to our own growth, our own transformation, our own restoration, because I think so many of us, when we've experienced pain, trauma, loss, disappointment in life, the last thing we want to do, Mako, is voluntarily submit our stories and say, here's my woundedness, here's my story, here's my vulnerability. But the Lord says, like I think about Psalm 51:17, the sacrifices acceptable to the Lord are a broken spirit. Yes. And we often nurture the very thing that is keeping us from freedom, from restoration, and from life. And so there's another word I'd love for you to talk about. It's humility. Yeah. Talk about the role and the posture of humility and how it is so very necessary as it plays into restoration.
Yeah, humility is something my father talked about a lot as a scientist. And he felt that his colleagues, many of his colleagues at Bell Labs, lacked humility when they talked about the ability of a machine language to create human speech. So he kept on saying how limited we are in our understanding of human language. And even if you segment the data and rearrange them, it doesn't mean that Alexa is going to sound like a human being. And he said that in the early 70s. He was utterly, laughed at the time. No, we'll be able to do this, 10 years from now. And here we are in 2022. We're still not there, right?
Yeah.
My father was right. Now, he would say not that he was right, but that we need to have humility and understanding of, and he wasn't necessarily a religious person, but he understood instinctively that knowledge is much higher complex than we understand right now, right? So you have to stand under the reality of human speech in this way, this case, and so humility to me is understanding our limitations, certainly, but also being human, right? Yeah. The word humility implies that we're being human. Of
course.
And what is misplaced is that kind of human vulnerability and weakness is seen as something to avoid. When Kenzugi and Japanese culture tells us that is the essence of beauty itself. That is why we are here put on this earth. And so going at it from the Japanese sense of beauty, weakness, vulnerabilities, and limitations are very much at the heart of human, understanding of beauty, human understanding of aesthetics. So that means when we gaze upon the Lord in His temple, and we are entering into that gaze not through our perfection, but through our imperfection. That's how we gaze upon the Lord. That's why Psalm 27 is sandwiched. I mean, it's a war psalm basically. It's a trauma psalm. And David is saying, no, the one thing I desire of the Lord, I want to be in the Holy of Holies, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord forever, right? So that turn, it can only come when we are being fully human. And under humility of that limitation, we understand that God's ways, God's communication is in fact perfect, but that we are imperfect, we are humbled, we are, broken in that place. But God's grace allows us to enter into the Holy of Holies through God's sacrifice, so that we can gaze upon the beauty of the Lord.
It's as if the key to our transformation has been sitting below, like right underneath our nose the whole time, and we've missed it because we think it's so far out there, yet here we go, back to the heart of the Father. Come to me, all you are weary. I'll give you rest. The sacrifice acceptable to the Lord is a broken spirit. He's saying, surrender, be vulnerable. I don't want to be reductionistic as we land this conversation, Mako, but I just think about where we started, breaking the paradigm of being avoidant of our brokenness. Like, we've got to shun it. And now we've said, okay, no, beauty is in brokenness. Then we said, all right, if beauty is in brokenness, how do we get there? Well, through community, through vulnerability, through staring down these rabbit holes of pain and allowing the Holy Spirit to bring healing to those. Is there anything else to that equation that you'd want to bring? Of course, we just talked about humility and such.
Yeah, I think actually one of the ways that we experience humility is through silence. And silence is another thing we avoid.
Yeah, why?
Why? Try to. Well, I think we are used to being, we're so fearful and we're so anxious. We cannot be alone with God. We're just so afraid of that. And I don't know, I'm sure it's different for each person, but we want to be busy, and we want to be useful, and we want to count. We want to build the check boxes of resumes, and I think it's a way that, again, post-industrial realities have crept into our education system, and how we value ourselves, how we measure up to the standards of what we think other people are measuring us. But, I have spent many years thinking about this in one of the most busiest places in the world, which is New York City, And I look back to my 15 years in New York City and 10 years in Ground Zero, and I try to think of what moments come out to me the most, right? What are the most valuable moments that I treasure for the rest of my life and beyond? Well, it's those moments when I wasn't checking those boxes. It's those moments when I literally wasted time, right? Sometimes intentionally with my kids, right? No agenda. You just hang out, or you just do whatever it is that, that day is giving you. And with other artists, the same thing. If I went to their studio with an agenda, I don't remember it. But if we, especially after 9/11, we couldn't really do anything. So we just had tea or coffee and talked all day. Dogs are running around, the kids are running around. I will never forget that. Why is that? I think it's because we are built, certainly for community, but we're built for the non-utilitarian way of being a human being, not a human doing. And then silence, right? I remember a time when near Ground Zero, this Robert De Niro's cafe was open without serving food. They could serve coffee. So we just sat in front, and I remember the sound. Like there was this silence, because there was nothing happening. Like Lower Manhattan is like today, it would be impossible to find silence. And I found that to be so beautiful. And so I asked myself, why am I afraid of silence? And because I'm afraid of myself, right? That what I find, whether, it may not, I may prove to be false in some way. And that could be real. But at the same time, I find that those moments when I endeavor to allow silence to be part of my journey, I tend to have a better memory of how, first of all, how God is speaking to me, but also how I can hear another person, and how those conversations become enriched with meaning and sacredness with my children. So that these are something that paradoxically, something that I think our time, as we wrestled with being quarantined and being shut down. Of course, all of us were frustrated. But isn't there something about our time, that reminds us that there is something important about slowing down and listening? Sometimes through silence.
I heard an interview you did with a Kenzugi master artist in Tokyo, and he said this, and I'd love for you to talk about it however you'd like. He said this: when something's perfect, it doesn't offer anything more. And I think this is a great landing point for listeners too. Flaws, he said, can be thrilling. Why?
Yeah, and as I have practiced more and more Kenzugi, and especially with my wife, who is a justice advocate, we see brokenness everywhere, and we find the traumas to be real and painful. But at the same time, we also find beauty in that reality. Perhaps even more beauty than I as an artist could even create. And that to me shows that brokenness, as painful as they may be, they allow us to enter into a kind of this interior castle, where we are able to discover and untap the mysteries that actually God has in store for us. And it's a kind of a portal into new creation. And so to me, even a Kenzugi master looking at the fragments and saying that, I'm not going to even attempt to mend this until I find this piece itself to be beautiful and complete. And that's such a profound message for the church.
It really is.
Because I think about my church, I think about our churches. Can we say that? Or are we trying to fix people into this ideal perfection of what a Christian ought to be? Now, there's certainly value for programs and restoration of marriages and so forth. I'm not discounting those, but really, what we need to be doing is we are all fragments, walking wounded, into our churches, and can we just pause and acknowledge that your fragment, it's so important.
Yes, because
it's unique. And there's no one like you and no experience like what you went through. So at least we can behold, right? Behold each other and say, let's behold until we are beautiful.
So good.
And perhaps the Kenzugi master will put us all the shards back into one mosaic, and then we can rejoice in that. And I think our act of humility would be to take in those fragments collectively, and not to try to create an assumed perfection, but to say no, even as broken as we are, we can be made beautiful and new. And there's a story, authority to, we have the authority to write our own story into the future, right? So that's part of what I would hope our churches can be moving forward.
Mako, that's so beautiful. I appreciate you so much. What a rich conversation. Thank you for joining me here today. I've really enjoyed our time together. Anything else you want to share before we leave?
No, I'm grateful for this conversation as well.
Thank you, sir.
And grateful for what you're doing.
I appreciate that. Hey, I would love for listeners to stay connected to you and to your work. Tell people how to connect.
I'm easy to find online. Just look up my name, and there's website, social media, everything is there. So I look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. And of course, guys, I'll put all of that and Mako's work in the show notes at wintoday.tv. But Mako, thanks again for being here.
Absolutely.